In other business news now, South Africa's youth debt crisis continues to worsen amid weak economic growth, high unemployment and slow reforms. Analysts have sought to highlight the growing issue as the country marks Youth Month, saying around 40% of credit defaulters are under the age of 35. It is further stressed that the youth are casualties of long-standing matters, including a failing labour market and a mismatch in education and skills development. Dehan Scherman from the National Debt Advisors speaks to us about this. Thank you so much for your time. First, talk us through the extent of what has been described as a growing youth debt crisis in South Africa.
Yes, so as you've said, up to 40% of South African credit defaults are by consumers under the age of 35. So this indicates that there's a large portion of the youth population that is actively missing payments. And it highlights not only a lack of financial literacy, but it may also highlight a lack of financial resources and stable working conditions for youth in South Africa today. So it definitely highlights that there's definitely a need for intervention by both government and private sector to assist the youth of South Africa in order to assist them in how to manage their finances, how to manage their debt. And it speaks to a greater problem, which is youth unemployment, as well as reckless lending practices to those youth.
You've touched on what I was going to ask next there, but in particular, the core of South African youth landing in serious debt. Yes, you mentioned maybe it could be a lack of education, a lack of skills training, as well as a poor education around finances. But we are sitting in 2025 and maybe past mistakes of other individuals within the labour and the South African landscape should be fair enough for, an indicator, especially young entrants into the market, what not to do in terms of getting into debt.
Exactly. And as a young person myself, when I entered into the working world, I had no idea of how to manage finances, of how debt worked. These were things that aren't necessarily taught at school or life orientation. So we're not, as young people, we're not equipped to responsibly manage ourselves and our financial livelihoods. And to a greater extent, we don't understand the impact that we have on the economy as a whole. Because, and I'm sure you'd agree with me, if young people were able to manage their finances responsibly, they'd be less reliant on the state. They would understand the implications of their actions, and they'd also be able to contribute more meaningfully to the economy.
And that's quite interesting. And I think, yes, the onus should also be on young people, but at the same time, there is a role to play for those who then lure South African youth into getting into debt. How far are we on the spectrum in South Africa where regulations should be stipulating that a certain individual who earns an amount that is set should not be dangled the carrot of getting into debt?
So within the National Credit Act, there are provisions for reckless lending, and the National Credit Regulator has actively pursued reckless lending. There's been a lot of instances where these matters have been referred to the National Tribunal Court. You've had credit providers paying a lot of fines. However, the bigger credit providers tend to be more strict when it comes to credit giving practices. They tend to have a lot more controls in place, a lot more compliance checks in place. It's generally speaking the smaller credit providers that tend to bend the rules a bit, and those are the ones that you should look out for. However, I can say that in terms of regulations, we have quite a robust legal framework that tries to protect consumers and tries to discourage reckless lending as much as possible. The onus is also on the consumer because we find that a lot of cases where reckless lending is alleged, the consumer tends to overestimate their affordability and their budget to try and apply for a loan. So it definitely works both ways. You have credit providers who are recklessly offering credit, but at the same time you have consumers who are also misrepresenting their affordability to be able to obtain that debt.
As a parting shot, what more needs to be done to curb exactly that you've explained in the latter, but also earlier on you referenced that the life orientation as a subject matter in schools could be a tool that, could further propel the education where finances are concerned.
Definitely. So as an indicator, we definitely need to have a greater emphasis on financial literacy and financial wellness within our greater society as a whole, as well as foster, I would say, ethical lending practices and normalize ethical lending practices within our country, because reckless lending has been an issue for a number of years, and it's going to continue to be an issue up until we're all able to come to the party and where both consumers and credit providers can do their part to ensure that we have an ethical credit lending practice.
Thank you so much, as always, for your input. Dehan Scherman is with the National Debt Advisors, talking us there through the growing crisis that has been dubbed the youth debt in South Africa.